Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our monthly IMAP webinar. My name is Pierre Beauregard. I'm the Canadian coordinator for IMAP. Today's headlines: covering the Koreas, traditional and non-traditional approaches to understanding. The International Media Association for Peace recognizes the vital role that journalists play in guarding against totalitarianism and supporting the expansion of freedom. IMAP represents a worldwide professional network of journalists who support a socially responsible and moral media to convey accurate content and addresses the challenges of our times based on the highest principles of ethical journalism, while understanding that universal values are key elements of a world of peace. Our moderator today is Dr. Michael Jenkins.
I'm right here.
Yes.
Ready to go.
Very good. Dr. Jenkins, president of the Washington Times Foundation, which sponsors the Washington Brief webcast. He's also the chairman of the Washington Times Holding, the LLC that owns the Times News Organization. He has led a number of well-received fact-finding trips to Korea and Japan, and have met with the legislative, executive, and intelligence and military leadership of those countries. As president of the nonprofit NGO, the Universal Peace Federation International, Dr. Jenkins has decades-long involvement in starting and conducting peace initiatives all over the world, particularly in the Northeast and the Middle East. Dr. Jenkins, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Pierre. We really appreciate your leadership and all of our UPF of Canada. Welcome. And to our viewers throughout America and throughout many countries of the world, we are so happy to see you again every Tuesday at 2 p.m. We have a seminar or webinar focused on Korea, different aspects of Korea. The first Tuesday of every month, we see the Washington Brief, which is an ongoing monthly program that is moderated by Ambassador Christopher Hill, former ambassador to Korea. Today, we have a distinguished panel of guests. We have Dr. Ok-Kyung Park. We have also Mr. Guy Taylor of the Washington Times. And we have Mr. Jacco Zwetsloot, who is a very well-known journalist in Korea. At this time, I'd like to introduce Dr. Ok-Kyung Park. Dr. Park is a Canadian citizen born in South Korea and migrated to Canada after completing her high school education in Seoul. She has been living in Montreal, Canada for almost 40 years. Dr. Park completed a PhD in social anthropology. Her research areas were West Sumatra, Indonesia, and Jeju, South Korea. She published a book on Jeju in 2018, and after 3 months of field work in 2016, she worked in the Canadian federal government for 20 years at the Immigration Department, the Canadian International Development Agency, as an advisor on gender and social development issues. Dr. Park lectured at Jeju National University for summer programs from 2011 to 2014. Dr. Park, we're very honored to receive you, and you're well known throughout Canada and the United States. Thank you so much. Welcome.
Thank you. Let me see. I would like to first...
Your screen looks good.
Yeah, screen. Share
your
the
screen is showing with your...
But I don't see it. Okay, so I have to enlarge the screen. Okay, now it works. So thank you, Chairman, for your kind introduction, and good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
First, let me express a word of gratitude to UPF for inviting me to this forum to talk about two Koreas and peace on this land. Time given is very short, I understand, so I will be fast. We all know that two Koreas are in a rather tense relationship these days, don't we? Rather than talking about political relations, I decided to talk about my personal life to give you a good picture of what it is like on the ground for people caught in this drama of divided nations still in war with each other. The end of war or peace treaty were never declared at the end of the Korean War in 1953. This means, in effect, the Korean War has been continuing for 70 years, much longer than war in Afghanistan. Korean people within South Korea and the Korean diaspora all over the world, they are organizing at the moment the end of war campaign. You can help us. Now, my talk consists of 4 chapters: South Korean context, and my interest in anthropology and Asia, and North Korea, and a brief closing remarks. Let's quickly look at Korea in the world map, a tiny territory on the far east end, a map of divided Korea, map of unified Korea in future that we are all aspiring for. Now, briefly, diaspora context. I was born in Korea in 1945 at the end of the Second World War, when Korea was liberated from Japanese colonial regime. So I'm called a child of liberation. Then we migrated to Brazil with my parents in 1964, yes. And then again to Canada in 1968. I spent almost 20 years for education in Canada, and then 20 years of work in Canadian federal government. Why we left Korea? Because of our grandfather, you see the picture here, and who went to North Korea in 1949. So he was branded as a communist, and his families, of course, are communists. So we left to avoid communist persecution. Here you see a picture of my family. My father and my youngest brother, who was not born, is not in this picture. The chubby little girl, that's me. And here is the ship by which we all left in Busan to Brazil. Here is a picture of 4 siblings in Toronto in 1970. And then 40 years later, the reunion of 4 siblings with the silver hair in Seoul, South Korea. Now, briefly, my interest in anthropology. I became interested in anthropology because of my socialization in Korea. When I was young in Korea, I was socialized that the teachings of Neo-Confucian ideology that tells us that women are inferior to men. This philosophy in practice is anchored in the Korean patriarchal system. And in this system, first, men and male line are most important to continue the family. And secondly, the role of offering ancestor worshipping ritual, which is the foundation of patriarchal system, is in the hands of men. And also the family wealth is in the hands of men. But the women are, once married, they are outsiders. There's nothing for women. And of course, this type of arrangement has not always been the case, but that's another story to tell. I always thought there must be other types of society, and I chose to study a matrilineal society in West Indonesia, West Sumatra, Indonesia. And yet, yes, indeed, I found one. So I went to Sumatra, there's a map, and Sumatra is on the left side on this map. Here you see territory of West Sumatra shaded in green. And here you see the longhouse where women live with children. And on the right, there is a rice barn, and male members cannot live in this house. In this society, women's role is to sponsor two most important, expensive life cycle rituals, wedding and installment of the lineage chief. And men's role is to represent the lineage. Here you see the lineage chief, mother's brother. Men as a husband, they are seed givers. Much later, I had an opportunity to go to Jeju Island in South Korea. And there I found a similar pattern as in West Sumatra. Women divers are so central and visible in Jeju society that an American diplomat sends in 1900 who visited Jeju called Jeju society the Amazon of Korea. He was very impressed. Here we see the monument of divers resistance movement against Japanese colonial control in 1932. This shows the places where the divers went to earn their living. Of course, diving in China, even up to Russia, Vladivostok, and many coastal ports in Japan and in Korea. This is the image of women divers, a recent image in 2016. Their life is demanding, and they rely on goddesses and gods through the intermediary of shamans' ritual. To introduce you some of my work, there is an article entitled Enigma of Male Ancestors in a Matrilineal Society in a book called A House Without a Daughter is a Dead House. Another book came out in 2018 about divers, and another book soon will come out, a book for children, story about a young girl, daughter of a diver in Jeju. Now, after that, I went to North Korea. I went there twice. And in my recent visit in 2018, I felt that for the first time, I found my motherland, and I even cried. And I don't know why. I still don't know. Some pictures in 1979 visit. And in 2018, I went to see my grandfather buried in the Patriot Cemetery with a stepbrother and his daughter living in Pyongyang. Last year, I'm almost finished. Last year, I submitted a research proposal to a university in South Korea, and I was refused. It's the project to do in Najin on northeast coast of tip of Korea. My closing remarks, I have a question. Would you go to North Korea to do business there? Do you think North Korea is the axis of evil as the American President Bush named it? As for me, I would like to go back to North Korea to do research. The title would be The Role of a Woman in Development of Market Economy in Najin, which is a platform of Sino-Korean market. I hope this will come through. Well, thank you. I hope I didn't take too much time.
Thank you, Dr. Pak. It's perfect, perfect timing, and most important presentation. We honor you, and we also honor your family members in North Korea as well as in the South. And your testimony and your writings are very, very moving to all of us. And I really appreciate opening our eyes to the fact that heart to heart, there's so much that needs to be done to heal the division of this nation. So Thank you very much, and we'll come back for questions in a few minutes.
Thank you.
Mr. Guy Taylor is the National Security Team Leader for the Washington Times. He's an award-winning foreign correspondent currently overseeing the Times State Department and intelligence community coverage. Mr. Taylor has engaged in extensive international reporting over the last 20 years, from Latin America to the Middle East to the Asia Pacific. His exhaustive coverage of U.S. policy towards the North Korea crisis has won accolades from across the political spectrum. His reporting on security, political, and economic developments in Mexico won a Virginia Press Association award. His reporting on Russia's attempts to influence the 2016 U.S. election was recognized with the Gerald R. Ford Journalism Prize for distinguished reporting on the presidency. We're proud of him at the Washington Times, and he has profound understanding of Asia. We welcome at this time Mr. Guy Taylor. Thank you, Guy.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jenkins. Thank you to the International Media Association for Peace and to the Universal Peace Federation. I also want to thank Jacco Zwetsloot, who we're going to hear from, but also Dr. Pak. Really, really interesting. I think I'm a journalist because I try to help other people tell personal stories. And whenever we can hear personal stories, I think it just makes it real what we're doing. So, and I thought your question of would you go to North Korea to do business? It's such a great question because, I'm getting to a point in my own experience as a journalist where the opportunity is almost in grasp to go to North Korea as a journalist. And it's a really difficult question, especially as a US citizen and American journalist, because it's such a closed regime controlled space that at the same time, there are obviously powers in the world that have offices in Pyongyang, and there are protecting powers for the United States. There are other governments that are able to do business there. So it's just a really interesting question. I'm the national security team leader, effectively the national security editor at the Washington Times, and I've reported around the region, really making trips there. I've made more than a dozen trips between Japan and South Korea and China over the last 20 years. And sometimes I'll spend as much as 3 weeks running around talking to people, gathering information for stories. And I really specialize in telling stories to an American audience or an English speaking audience, but the stories are for the world. The Washington Times gets read by diplomats and interested civil society people really all over the world, whether they're in the Unification movement or they're just in even wider society. It's incredible how closely our newspaper gets read by foreign governments. I find that in the access I end up getting to diplomats in the United States, or when I'm visiting somewhere overseas, representing the Washington Times. And I know that my staff experiences the same thing. When it comes to getting reliable information about North Korea and what's going on inside North Korea, in a nutshell, it's difficult. And it can be difficult to know what's accurate. I think what I want to emphasize in my little introductory remarks here is that we're coming off a really historic moment in the whole trajectory, the arc of trying to get information about North Korea. And when I say it's historic, is definitely from the US perspective. I think that I'm going to pick some things that don't have to do with the succession within the Kim dynasty. I'm just talking about some random cultural events here. The fact that a famous American basketball star traveled to Pyongyang and had multiple personal friendly visits with the young leader of the Kim regime. I'm talking about Dennis Rodman and Kim Jong-un. That was about 10 years ago. And I mark that as the beginning of that unique period. And I follow it right up to the 2018 Olympics in Seoul. And then for the year or so after that, through the summits, these historic summits between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un, which are really unlike anything that we had ever seen in the 70 years. Just the fact that an American president would sit one-on-one with a North Korean leader is pretty amazing. The reason I'm emphasizing this is these were paradigm shifting in terms of information emanating out of North Korea about Kim Jong-un. Here's an example. In April of 2018, a couple of months after Kim Yo-jong showed up in Seoul behind Mike Pence at the Olympics, in that historic moment of the Olympics, and
Yes.
going up to the north and north teams coming down, and all of this interchange of information and people, like at historic levels. The world famous K-pop girl band Red Velvet, and I'm like dating myself, because if I talk to young South Koreans, they'll say, oh, the Red Velvet, they're old, you know. It's like, yeah, maybe they're 30 years old now. Not even. I'll probably get in trouble for saying that because they're a lot younger than that still. But Red Velvet traveled to Pyongyang and performed for Kim Jong-un and his friends, and then met with him. And it was all videotaped by South Korean TV crews who were invited to go to the north and watch this cultural exchange of people from this younger generation, really young people who a lot of us stand around and say, oh, no, young South Koreans, they don't want to reunify with the North. They saw what happened between East and West Germany. It's too much. We don't want to take on the differences. When in fact, the possibility of a peaceful meeting over something like pop music with a young leader in the North was inconceivable. And think about how much video, genuine video exchanges, information in this really hyper closed environment in the North that came out of these. I think there's something to be learned from that, which is that cultural, sports, basic civil society, I would put like news media maybe next down the list. But if you take politics and security posturing and maybe put that way on the back burner, and you focus on things, I guess what I'm talking about is really soft power, right? That's a way for exchanges between North and South. I'm going to just shift here now and finish with the 3 minutes I have left on what about just news media? I mean, how do I go about determining whether the Washington Times today or tonight, I mean, we're already doing it on our website right now, but how do I decide if our PDF print edition that still gets circulated to like more than 100,000 people on email in a couple of hours, how do I decide if we're going to put on the front page of that tonight? Are we going to put that the North Koreans tested a submarine launched ballistic missile from a submarine, not a barge like the 2015 one or the 2019 one? They've actually got, because the DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency in the US, they've got a report out that says we think the North Koreans have one ballistic missile capable submarine, but we're not really sure. Publicly, we're not saying. I don't know. There are reports all over the news media on the internet in English from the last 8 hours claiming that that's what happened. How do I verify that? I've got the Associated Press that I can work with. The Associated Press had a famous correspondent, a little bit older than me, named Eric Talmadge, who was in and out of Pyongyang something like 70 times, maybe more, over a 10-year period, and unexpectedly passed away in 2019. God bless the Associated Press and Eric Talmadge. I don't think that the Associated Press's coverage has gotten to where it was with him. So maybe I can trust the AP. I've got Yonhap, wonderful. It's a semi-state controlled news agency in Seoul, generally very accurate. But Yonhap is also pushing its own line, so you have to sort of take it with a grain of salt. The current government in Seoul very, very much wants to get a meeting so badly with Kim Jong-un that they're willing to engage in sunshine policy, which is fine. That's totally fine. I'm not making a judgment. I'm just saying you got to you got to read Yonhap with a grain of salt. So you need situational awareness about these big news organizations. Then we get to the various other tons of publications in Seoul. I cannot emphasize enough how important the civil society and media in South Korea is to the rest of the world understanding North Korea. Because if it wasn't a free media space in South Korea, what will we have? We would have a handful of people that get into North Korea and risk getting arrested. A handful, like the number we can count on the fingers of both of my hands of diplomats from other countries willing to give information. And then we would have China. That's it. We wouldn't have other information. So we're completely reliant on South Korea. Yonhap, Chosun Ilbo, Sege Ilbo, Jungang Daily, which is connected to New York Times, Donga Ilbo, Korea Times. A lot of these have English language versions. They're all working on telling a story about North Korea, trying to source stories. There's others like that are newer that have a US connection like NK News. And then there are think tanks in Seoul, an amazing civil society. There's IFONS, Institute for Foreign Affairs and National Security, Sejong Institute, KNDA, Korean National Diplomatic University. And then there are 28,000 or more quote unquote defectors or escapees or former North Koreans who became South Koreans and moved to South Korea. And then there are the individuals that work with them. Some of these people are in parliament in Seoul. I mean, that the relationship between the defector community and the South Korean government is a sensitive one. It's not very clearly understood by the rest of the world. And then there are some think tanks like INSS, the Institute for National Security Strategy, which, depending on who you ask, has a connection to NIS, which is South Korean intelligence, basically. That think tank has some of the highest level North Korean defectors working at it, and they will actually take meetings with journalists and give their impression about what's going on in the North. So that's one area I've sought to positively exploit and learn from on visits to Seoul to develop relationships with the North Korean defector community, because sometimes these are people who've worked directly with the Kim regime and can tell you, yeah, that whole narrative that's being pushed is totally inaccurate. Let me explain to you why it's actually something else is actually true. This was really important. I'm going to conclude with this. This was really important in trying to write stories for the US media or for the Washington Times about the teams of negotiators surrounding Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un during the Singapore and Hanoi summits. Some of our reporting in the Washington Times, I went to Seoul and I spent basically 2 months trying to work with the INSS to get a list and a background of everyone who would be on the North Korean team. And then we published it. We published a chart and we published articles about it. And this is really important because this is like public information if this is in Europe or the United States. But and the South Koreans, it's public information. But when you're dealing with North Korea, almost nothing is verifiable. And it's the term that gets thrown around is Kremlinology, because it's like trying to figure out what was going on inside the Kremlin during the height of the Soviet Union. I'm happy to talk more once we get into a Q&A about some of my experiences with North Korean defectors over the years, as well as with organizations like Free North Korea Radio and Suzanne Schulte and groups that are trying to get media messages into North Korea, whether it's on data sticks or by broadcasting or cell phone communications with people inside. But I'm going to conclude there because I've spoken very quickly and I think I've used up my 10 minutes. This is such an interesting and exciting topic. I'm really happy to be here.
Thank you, Guy. It's just excellent to receive your insights, and we're very excited about this topic also. And the challenges of getting clear information from the North are profound, and yet you've done amazing work to find out facts that the Times was able to deliver that wasn't easy for anyone else to get. We're very, very happy with this program today. We thank you. Also, I'd like to bring forward at this time Mr. Jacco Zwetsloot. Jacco is a podcast host on North Korea-related issues for NK News. Previously was Director of Business Innovation for HMP Law, and prior to that, he was a Senior English Editor at the Korean Overseas Culture and Information Service, a connoisseur of North Korean comics. I'm sure there's secrets to find from the comics also. Jacco has a BA in Modern European Studies and German from the University of Melbourne, a BA in Asia Studies from Monash University, and an MA from Leiden University. Jacco is fluent in English, Korean, German, and Dutch, and we're very, very honored to have Jacco back, and look forward to your great presentation, Blind Men Discovering the Elephant, Exploring North Korea from as many angles as possible. Welcome, Jacco.
First of all, I'd like to thank the International Media Association for Peace for inviting me, and thank you to our moderator, Dr. Michael Jenkins, and also thank you to my fellow panelists today, Dr. Park and Guy Taylor. It was interesting listening to them, and I'm truly impressed at the different ways of knowing about North Korea that have been discussed already. And it reminds me of that ancient and well-known Indian parable. I'll share with you one brief version. A group of blind men heard that an elephant had been brought to the town, but none of them were aware of its shape and form. They said, "We must inspect and know it by touch, of which we are capable." So when they found it, they groped about it. The first person whose hand landed upon the trunk said, "This being is like a thick snake." For another one whose hand reached its ear, it seemed like a kind of fan. As for another person whose hand was upon its leg, he said, "The elephant is a pillar like a tree trunk." The blind man who placed his hand upon its side said the elephant is a wall. Another who felt its tail described it as a rope. The last felt its tusk, stating that the elephant is hard, smooth, and like a spear. In many ways, North Korea is like that elephant, and knowledge producers, whether they be security analysts, sanctions experts, journalists, defectors, economists, demographers, humanitarian workers, or human rights activists, are all touching different parts of that elephant from different angles. Which parts they touch and from which angles are to some extent determined by what field of knowledge creation they are involved in. And yet they all know parts of the elephant. Until the early 2000s, the parts of the elephant that were touched and the angles they were touched from were limited. North Korea was mainly seen as a nominally communist economy and a security threat. So the types of experts whose voices were heard in public discourse were also limited. At that time, it was almost possible to read everything published on North Korea, at least in English. Now, however, we have so many ways of knowing and seeing North Korea. And hopefully, most knowledge creators are humble enough to admit that they only see parts of it, or in other words, they only touch one or two parts of that elephant. As the host of the NK News podcast for North Korea specialty news agency nknews.org, I don't claim to be a knowledge producer. I see myself as a knowledge curator, trying to bring together as many different voices from as many perspectives as I can to build up over time as full a picture of the elephant that is North Korea as is possible. I once viewed North Korea as not a full elephant, but merely half of one, a piece of Korea waiting to be reunified with its southern neighbor. The South Korean constitution still claims jurisdiction over all the Korean peninsula and denies North Korea's existence as a country. For decades, South Koreans were taught that their North Korean brethren were like Sleeping Beauty, waiting for Prince Charming to come and kiss her awake so that she could get married and live happily ever after. It's taken me a long time to wake up to the fact that North Korea is a real country with just as many ways of knowing it as other countries. There are over 25 million people there living their lives, going to work, falling in love, struggling to stay healthy, trying to be happy, marrying, having children, and dying. Yes, their struggles are different and much more intense than those of us who are lucky to be on this Zoom call today, but their lives are not defined by those struggles. They are human beings just as we are. South Koreans are also, by and large, coming around to the idea that North Korea is a real country in its own right. Most young South Koreans under the age of 40 are content to see it as a completely separate nation and leave it alone. And that perspective is also part of seeing the elephant, if not touching it. When I started hosting the NK News podcast early in 2018, over 200 episodes ago, I had the naivety to think that I would run out of guests to speak to in about a year or so. How wrong I was. I now know I'll never run out of ways of looking at North Korea. I believe this is important and valuable because the people of North Korea deserve to be seen as fully human, and by approaching North Korea as a real country with millions of facets and not simply as an object of fear, hatred, or pity, or as an aid recipient, or as a passive object waiting to be annexed by South Korea. We can approach North Korean people as real people and North Korean society as a real society, and not just as proxies for their leaders and the ruling elites. Now, those leaders and elites are also part of the elephant, and they must be studied and understood too, but not at the expense of the rest of the elephant. I'm happy to say that in the NK News 205 podcast episodes to date, I have been honored and lucky to talk to a wide variety of men and women, not just from both Koreas, but from other countries too. There have been young defectors, old defectors, diplomats, academics, pro and anti-engagement people, religious workers, hawks and doves, people sympathetic to North Korea, and those who want to see regime change. We've discussed women's health, economics of unification, humanitarian aid work, helping defectors in South Korea, digging up American soldiers' remains in North Korea, the 13th World Festival of Youth and Students, the arts, war and peace, and so much more in between. Of course, since I work for a news website, it's also important to cover the latest developments. That's also necessary and important, but it doesn't drown out the other stories and voices. We try to keep a balance. And also because our podcast is in English, it does mean that we are either limited to talking to people who can speak English, or we have to employ the services of an interpreter. We've done this a few times in the past with the podcast, and we aim to be doing more of that in 2022 and beyond. However, we will never be able to build up a complete picture of North Korea. Who can claim to understand any country in all its fullness? I have lived in 3 countries in my lifetime, and I only have an imperfect understanding of each. Others are also trying to build up a more complete and accurate pictures of North Korea than merely a security or nationalist-focused framework. I commend the International Media Association for Peace for bringing together diverse groups like today's panel to talk about North Korea from multiple perspectives. There is also 38 North, the Korea Society, and CSIS, and that's just in the English language. Daily NK produces some output in English, but most of its excellent work is in Korean. And there are other institutions doing great work in Korean and in Japanese too. So let's keep touching the elephant from as many different angles and perspectives as possible and get closer and closer to a more complete and accurate picture. Thank you all.
Thank you, Jacco. That's excellent. And we really are always coming away from your presentations with new understanding. And last time you presented statistics on North Korean attitudes on reunification and South Korean attitudes on reunification. And it is very interesting to learn that we need to listen. We need to hear from as many sources as we can, because easily we form opinions based on whatever information we have. And if our information is limited, we form opinions that may not be accurate. I think you're helping us to bring a lot of accuracy to our understanding. And I think the human aspect of North Korea cannot be overemphasized. The fact that Secretary of State Pompeo was just a featured speaker on our Think Tank 2022 on September 18th, he said the one unique thing that the past administration brought to the table was an understanding that not only do we need diplomacy, the political engagement, and all the different aspects of analysis from intelligence and so forth, but we also need to engage people to people, human to human. And that's what led to the meeting with Kim Jong-un. And I think that, as Guy mentioned, the fact that Dennis Rodman went there with one of our good friends, a professor from Columbia University, was very, very informative, very interesting. Anna Fifield's book on the great successor is also quite interesting on these aspects, and we're learning more and more. I think the prospects for peace are really reasonable and real. I'd like to go back to Dr. Pak, a special question for you on the women's equality and status in North Korea. Since the women are driving the markets, especially in the Chinese North Korean area, at least before the pandemic, but still there's something going on, I'm sure. Is the equality of women changing like it has with men in the South? Is there a change going on and a modernization in North Korean culture that way?
I haven't started my research yet. I have read quite a bit, and from my reading, what I understand is the market that is called the Changmadang at the moment. They are started by women when the state cannot provide essentials, food and clothes to its people. A woman had to come out and feed their family. So that's how it started. Now it has become much wider, and I think there are about 400 different markets all over in North Korea. And the one in Najin is very interesting because it's close to Chinese border. And so that's why I wanted to study, but my proposal is refused. So, but they're not going to stop me. I'm going to find other ways to finance my research, and I'm going to go there. But yes, the market has been developed by women. So their economic role, I think that's very important, assures.
Yes, it is.
Yes.
Yes. Yes. And as Jacco said, families are growing and, marrying and dying and living their lives. And it's not a simple matter. It shouldn't be simplified, but actually people are there trying to find happiness. And it's quite severe right now with the starvation. So Guy, a question comes for you. Do you think that the sanctions that have been imposed are really making the difficulty to get information from North Korea worse, more difficult? Should sanctions be lifted? What's your analysis as you've seen the issue from all angles? Should the sanctions be lifted in some way to open up the relationships with North Korea?
Yeah, I think I look at this question really from a classical global security perspective. And I end up asking the question about the powers that be that are imposing the sanctions, and the sanctions regime is led by the United States. I know the UN Security Council is part of the sanctions regime, but really it's led by the United States. So then we have to ask ourselves, is it within the US vital interest to ease the sanctions at this point? And if we're asking whether it's within the US vital interest, then we ask, is it within the US vital interest for companies, whether they're American or from one of the dozens of countries in East Asia or South Asia or the Middle East or anywhere else in the world, having those companies have an easier time, or Chinese companies, to do business with state-owned companies in North Korea, is that within the vital interest of the purveyor of those sanctions? And I think the consensus on this in Washington for the last 30 years or more has been, about 30 years, has been, no, it's not within the vital interest. So I think a more subjective way to answer the question is, I don't know whether a lifting of sanctions would do anything other than further legitimize the North Korean government. And right now, the North Korean government maintains what I would describe as like a Soviet era control on the movement of information in the country. So the idea that Jacco and I might get together and do a podcast in Pyongyang or roll out a newsletter or a website, it's just not going to be allowed at all by the regime. And that's really up to the North Korean government to decide. But it's reality. So I don't see how easing sanctions is going to change that policy. It might lead to a flood of new information and people into North Korea, but then we see this sort of this trap or this paradox where the North Korean government is very protective about that, for instance, and it tends to refuse humanitarian aid and refuse the idea of this influx of outside people and money. So it's a difficult question. I think it's a really good question, and that's my initial
Thank
response.
you, Guy. So, Jacco, one thing that we've noticed is that the treatment of defectors has changed since the President Moon's administration has gone forward with opening up relations with North Korea. And how are the defectors being treated at this time? Is there hopes that they will not speak out, or they won't cause trouble, or are they being silenced in any way, or what's your experience with the defectors? I know in the earlier years before the Moon administration, defectors were really treated, very, very special, and their information was quite important, and still is today. Of course, we met a number of defectors on our trip there, especially the deputy ambassador to the UK, so Tae Young-ho, and now he's a member of parliament. So it's quite an unusual. How are the defectors being treated from your point of view, or what's their status in South Korea now?
Yeah, I think if you look at it over the long term, from 1953 until about, let's say, 1998, the number of North Koreans who came to South Korea each year was very small. It was pitifully small, fewer than 100 people each year. And generally, they were young men of military age, often soldiers themselves. And so they were feted in South Korea. They were really celebrated, given large sums of money, and were brought around to give anti-communist talks to factories and workplaces, and were given prominent speaking platforms. In the mid-1990s, the number of defectors increased sharply with the famine in North Korea and with more movement possible through China and Southeast Asia. And so that increase in the number of defectors, plus the increase in dialogue between North Korea and South Korea, both of them led to a decrease in the importance, the social and political importance of defectors. So defectors were no longer given quite such large of money, were no longer taken around to factories and workplaces to give anti-communist speeches, etc. So their importance has diminished socially and politically, but generally speaking, I don't see in the last few years under President Moon, I don't see that they've been silenced. I mean, we certainly have on cable television still two programs, Iman Gup, or Now on My Way to Meet You. It's a program that introduces interviews defectors each week, and also the Moranbong Club on a rival television network. So they're still going strong. And as you mentioned, Tae Young-ho himself is a member of the National Assembly, and there's another North Korean defector who runs the Free North Korean Radio, and there's another one that's doing the leaflets. Now, the South Korean government does, of course, still under the national security law, try to control all forms of communication to and with North Korea. And under that, in the last year, they have passed a law to forbid the civic groups sending leaflets into North Korea, calling that a security concern. Now, there's certainly some politics involved there, but generally, I would say that defectors in South Korea, they're certainly not not mistreated by the Korean government. The broader issue has been that they find it very difficult to adjust to South Korean society. So the broader issue is, how do South Korean people treat North Korean defectors? And the fact is that it's been hard for them to get good jobs and maintain good jobs because of perhaps entrenched discrimination or beliefs about North Korean inadequacy or mistrust of North Koreans. So there are social difficulties that they face here, and those won't go away in a short period of time. That's going to take a long time to work at.
Thank you so much. Ms. Pak, Dr. Pak, North Korea and South Korea have the same traditions in terms of Korean culture. To me, it's not surprising at all that you would shed tears when you went back to the motherland. But at the same time, how much can that, in other words, are all the Korean cultural traditions, from the festivals and, you know, the whole traditions of honoring the ancestors and all of the different Korean traditions that are not political, how is that a possible bridge? Isn't that kind of a heartbeat that wants to come back together? What do you see about that cultural? They're the same people. They're the same. There's the same family.
Yes, exactly. And especially in cultural area, traditions, people think we are the same. They're our families and they do same things. So that's where the heart meet people from North and South. And that's what people emphasize. We must meet. When we meet, we talk about how we live, how they live, family members. You saw in my presentation, there used to be family reunification. Now it's, I guess it's because of COVID or exactly what has happened, but it's not happening. But that's one thing that everybody wants to happen, because people are getting old and they're
Yes, right.
dying. Yes.
And when they had the first large opening of North Koreans and South Koreans coming together,
Yes.
it was such a tearful reunion of family members. People had been separated from their brothers for 50 years, and sisters and parents, and you know, and then they had to get back on the bus and go back to North Korea, and they've never been able to come together again for the most part. Why isn't this more open? Why can't we have more exchange? What's the fear is that it will cause the North Korean people to change and want to move towards the South? What's the concern?
You sound like saying it's North Korea who is stopping it, but I think it's the sanctions of United States and American government that hinders many of these things. And earlier, the journalist mentioned that easing sanctions to North Korea will legitimize the government. But you know, the sanctions, that impact it has on people, family, children, and especially women, it's inhuman. It's something that should stop, but it's the American government which is doing this. Yes, so I have a different opinion from him about this question.
Well, there's starvation going on. There's immense suffering throughout Korea going on at this time. Yes. And yet North Korea will not allow the Chinese to freely cover the food needs right now. And Kim Jong-un is very firm about it. We're going to have the, whole determination to get back to the fundamentals of self-reliance and really overcoming all the challenges. So, Guy, in the light of all that suffering and everything, Korea is amazingly high tech and technologically savvy in terms of development of cyber attacks, cyber development, and missile development. It's a phenomenal thing. They have the highest technology in that area. How does this work? And they just launched a missile from a submarine.
yes, it is to protect
Go ahead, Dr. Pak. You
Korea
wanted to say something?
in war situation. And there is, what is the name of this? There's a military exercise on Korean territory, which is surveying North Korea. They can hit anything, anywhere, anybody in North Korea. It's scary for North Korea facing this situation. So developing these weapons is one way of self-protecting, but I think Kim Jong-un said we can all drop this, but come to the table and we want end of war, peace treaty. Then we're secure, but this is not happening.
Guy, they just launched a missile from a submarine. How does that impact the relations of the U.S., ROK, and North Korea?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing, just in my response to Dr. Pak is I'm trying, I sometimes feel like my hands are a little bit tied because I made the commitment to try to be an impartial journalist. And I do have some strong opinions, but I tried to do it just to present what I'm seeing in sort of analysis. So I fully respect your opinion on this. And I look at it very much through a security lens, because that's my academic expertise as a master's candidate in global security studies as well, which is almost like the opposite side of the same coin of peace studies. It's just very much from a security perspective. And I end up asking the question of, is it the Americans and the US government, this sort of this power that has almost militarized globalization, right, in the last 90 years, or not 90, but 70 or 80 years?
Yes.
Or is it the North Koreans that have militarized this conflict, where you've got a UN Security Council, again, it's the security factor there, but this UN Security Council that has on it all of these organizations of humans. China is a permanent member, the Russians permanent member, France, UK, United States, and then all these other organizations that are rotating members, and these UN Security Council pointing its finger at the government in Pyongyang during the decades since the armistice, saying, don't make nuclear weapons, don't make ballistic missiles, and then having that government continue to do it right up to today, where a submarine launched ballistic missile test would be a violation of a couple of different UN Security Council resolutions.
In your opinion, do you think if North Korea stops making these ballistic missiles and so on, there will be peace? And they will
I don't know if the current US government is capable of delivering on that. I think what's really interesting is we had this really unusual, both very popular, but also very unpopular president come along in a sort of wild twist in Washington, in Donald Trump, who said, I don't care about the rules. I'll meet directly with the head of that government. And if he agrees to give up the weapons and the stuff, we'll lift all the sanctions right now. It was wild. And it almost happened. And it was interesting. I recently heard Trump's former Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, sorry, just to finish my thought quickly. He recently was really revealing at a think tank 2022, deep in the conversation, he kind of opened up a little bit about his read of the room at the Hanoi summit. And he said, and I would encourage people to go find the archive of this because it's late, it's like 80 minutes into the presentation. And he says, I don't think Kim Jong-un was well briefed for the meeting. And I don't think the people around him told him, if you come into this meeting and you agree to do all this, these guys are actually going to lift sanctions. They're going to recognize your government. They're going to lift everything. And they got to that moment, and Kim Jong-un kind of froze, and it looked like he didn't understand what was happening. This is Mike Pompeo's interpretation. So I wasn't in the room. I was down the street in a crowd of about 400 people, and I had two kids that they claimed to be Canadians who had a backpack full of beer, and they wanted to share it with me as I watched Kim Jong-un and the security guards run into the hotel. We had another senior correspondent inside the media center doing our White House coverage, but I digress. I've gone off topic.
Great
I've
topic.
Answer for you.
Oh, that's good, Guy. That's excellent. I think there's a lot to learn. Jacco, build on what Guy has shared. In terms of your experience analyzing things from every angle, everything North Korea does, whether it's the 70th anniversary celebration or whatever, or even this missile. Yes, it's a missile. Yes, it's technology development. But the most important thing to understand is what's the message? What's the message they're sending now? From your point of view, what message is now being sent?
Oh gosh. Okay. Yes. North Korea always has multiple audiences in mind when the government says something official. So there are domestic audiences. There are audiences in South Korea. And there are audience in Washington, and I think that it seems a bit simplistic. It seems a bit cliche to say it, but from time to time, North Korea feels that it has slipped down the list of priorities of the United States government, of the United States president, and the United States State Department. And at those times, North Korea occasionally does something to try to work its way back up that ladder of priorities again, and
that may be the message. That may be the main message.
And that can be something as simple as sending a missile, or doing a nuclear test. I think that in 2017, it did a lot of different things to try to get America's attention, and it sure got America's attention. And President Trump, of course, talked about fire and fury, etc. But I think that this is. 2017 was an excellent example of North Korea's brinkmanship, because ultimately it cost North Korea little, but it got what it wanted, which was direct talks with the United States. It got a president to sit down face to face with the chairman of the Supreme of the State Affairs Committee, and that is something that they'd looked forward to for decades. So if there's one actor that is really excellent at playing that walking that fine line between trying to get somebody upset, but not too upset that they start a war over it, that's North Korea. I've drifted from your original question, which is what's their message now? But I think that the message now domestically is, look at what we can do. We are a strong and prosperous nation.
Yes,
we have
right.
these capabilities. To South Korea, the message is, get us some talks with America again. And to America is, here we are, let's talk once more and see if we can't get some sanctions relief for us.
Well, one of our regulars on the Washington Brief, Dr. Alexander Manzaroff, who's at Georgetown University, it was the interesting time when no one could find Kim Jong-un, and everybody assumed he was sick and he was dying or he might be dead, all that kind of thing. And then finally he emerges again, completely healthy. Dr. Manzaroff was one of the analysts and professors that correctly said from the day one, there's nothing wrong with him, he's fine. There's nothing wrong with it. Reports were coming out everywhere, except the Washington Times, by the way. Everywhere it was saying he's sick, the Chinese doctors are there, all this kind of thing. Dr. Manzaroff was correct. And at the end, Dr. Manzaroff told me he was not happy with the fact that he wasn't getting enough attention. So he set up this worldwide concern. And so, Guy, you have analyzed this from many perspectives. So what do you think about one nation? Can Korea become one nation again? How would you see that happening? And what is it? It's not going to happen overnight, but what would it take for Kim Jong-un to really feel secure to start to really denuclearize and have a state that's recognized by the world and starts to prosper and goes through an economic, exponential growth suddenly, which I think America would like to see happen with North Korea. That's what I think Donald Trump really wanted to see, a total outpouring of resource and development. And because North Korea doesn't want to hang around with China as their only partner, that's for sure. Go ahead, Guy. And then Mr.
Well, it's such a good question. I think that one of the reasons the Trump-Kim summits basically, I want to be careful with how I use this word. I mean, they ended with a failure to reach a big denuclearization agreement. But the extent to which they were a failure at all, I mean, there were historic examples of diplomacy, which is pretty interesting.
Exactly.
But I think the reason it didn't go further was that neither the North Koreans or the South Koreans were truly ready. There may have been political leaders in the South that said they were ready, but as Jacco pointed out, actually, I'll get to that in a second. I think the DNA of the two governments needs to change in order for them to fit together as a single helix, if you follow the metaphor. As Jacco pointed out, the South Korean constitution doesn't recognize the existence of the North. So for Kim Jong-un, for Moon Jae-in, who's got something like 5 or 6 months left in office, to come through on a peace declaration, it's going to be a peace declaration that is not backed up by a constitutional change. I don't see there being a constitutional change in a matter of 6 months given the parliamentary system in Seoul. So there needs to be time for the DNA of the government. And I get it. People can come together. There can be a connection. But when you're talking about actual reunification, there actually has to be a change in government from North and South. And there also does it in the North. The North has to open up from what has been a tradition of building its entire identity around security preparation to preserve the survival of a tiny ruling regime. That we've seen, I mean, interestingly, the Sejong Institute in Seoul has attempted to explore North Korean economics of the last 20 years as deeply as possible in search of signs that there could be a DNA change happening in the North's government towards some kind of economic opening, like Dr. Pak and you, Dr. Jenkins, were referencing with women-run markets, for instance. But I don't know that, I mean, I think there has to be so much change for the two governments. So I almost feel like the goals should be smaller. I think the Kaesong Industrial, yeah.
Thank you, Guy. Go ahead, Dr. Pak. Let's have a final round of comments, starting with Dr. Pak. Go ahead.
North and South, I think it's the question of it's not the question of denuclearization. What North Korea wants is peace treaty so that they don't have to worry about war. Imagine you are constantly pressed down with the threat of war. What else can you do but strengthen your self-defense mechanism to protect you? It's been going on 70 years and it's still going on. And unless that is lifted, North Korea can't do anything else but to protect its people. And it's the only thing they have is a nuclear armament. And as soon as American government comes for peace treaty and allow Korea to be in peace, I think things will change.
Thank you, Dr. Pak. That's a beautiful vision of the future.
Yes.
I think that, but I want to bring it to Jacco, and I'd like to say something first, Jacco. Maybe you can help us with this. There is a problem that I see, is that the Juche ideology is not a benign, passive, let's get along with everybody ideology. The ideology says that America's an intruder, South Korean government is illegitimate, the ROK does not exist, North Korea should govern the whole thing, and it should be under the Kim regime. So that's an aggressive position, and it's not benign or passive. It's not asleep either. There's a cyber unit that we were briefed on that's very aggressively attacking the South Korean banks, the South Korean military, NIS, and everything, thousands of attacks every day. It's not a benign, passive thing. So, Jacco, help us with this. And take us wherever you want to go for your final comments.
For the sake of balance, I have to say, I did point out earlier that the South Korean constitution does claim jurisdiction over the entire Korean peninsula, but so does the North Korean constitution. It is true to say that the constitution, the basic frameworks of both governments, does not recognize the legitimacy of the other, and that North Korea still claims that the revolution has not been completed, and at least in its propaganda, it seeks to move on to final victory. And the question is, well, what is final victory? Well, final victory is the spreading of the revolution throughout South Korean territory and the overthrow of the yoke of American imperialism. Now, does Kim Jong-un actually think that these are achievable goals? Maybe not. Maybe these are, there's more value to be had in simply saying that that's what he wants to do for internal purposes and for regime stability than in actually trying to carry that out. I also want to just respond to Dr. Park. I think we now accept as a fait accompli that North Korea has nuclear weapons, but that wasn't always the case. And of course, not only was that not always the case, until Kim Il-sung died, North Korea was very strong in saying, we reject nuclear weapons, we do not want nuclear weapons, we are not trying to develop nuclear weapons, we hate the idea, we're ideologically opposed to nuclear weapons. And in fact, North Korea invited peace activists from around the world to march through the streets of Pyongyang with banners saying, no nukes in Korea, no nukes in Korea. Let's just hold that in our minds for a second there, because now here we are, 25 years later, North Korea now has nuclear weapons. Now, you don't simply go to a supermarket and pick up nuclear weapons. You don't say, well, we're under threat of war, I think we'll get some nukes. Nuclear development, the development of a nuclear arsenal takes a long time, takes a lot of planning, and takes an incredibly large amount of resources that could be used in other ways, such as, for example, improving healthcare or propping up the failing ration control system and food distribution system. So North Korea has made choices over the years to put its resources, to invest time and manpower into developing the nuclear arsenal that it has today. It's not something that it just picked up secondhand at a flea market. We have to bear these things in mind. And that was at the same time as saying, we reject nuclear weapons, we don't want nuclear weapons, we're not interested in nuclear weapons. So, North Korea hasn't always spoken completely frankly and honestly. And so it's easy to see North Korea sometimes as an underdog, as a victim of oppression by America, but North Korea also has designs of its own, and those designs include, as I said before, the extension of the revolution into South Korea and final victory, and that being the North Korean vision of unification. Now, every vision of unification has winners and losers, and the North Korean vision of unification would mean a great loss to the people of South Korea, to the freedoms that we enjoy in South Korea, to the wonderful chaos that is the dynamic political discourse in South Korea on left and right. That would all be lost if North Korea's vision of unification were to ultimately be victorious. I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacco. And then, Guy, your final thoughts for today. And then, if you gentlemen wouldn't mind, I'd like to come back to Dr. Pak for her final comment again, because we kind of came back on her statement and discussed that a little bit. Go ahead, Guy.
I'll try to be just very brief then. I think that this question of what is the vision of unification, that's something that has to be updated. It has to constantly change. I have had the opportunity, I think 3 years in a row, to speak at KINU, the Korean Institute for National Unification. They hold an annual event. And this question of what does unification, if we're really talking about what does it actually look like, it has to constantly change with the times. The other questions I want to just leave on are, is it in China's strategic interest for North Korea to be unified with South Korea? Or is it in China's strategic interest for North Korea to be a nuclear armed sort of pariah state? And likewise, is it in America's interest? I brought up America's vital interests earlier. Is it in America's vital interest for North Korea to be that nuclear wielding pariah state? And is it in America's interest for South Korea to be a sort of beacon of free society and free markets? These are all questions that I think matter going forward. So that's it for me. Thank you.
We'll have to invite everyone back soon for another round of this wonderful discussion. Dr. Pak, we really appreciate you. Why don't you give us your final statement today?
Thank you.
We thank you for being with us.
Yes, I would like to go back to Jacco's comment that Kim Il-sung, in the beginning, he wasn't interested in, he was pacifist and he wasn't interested in nuclear weapons and so on. That might be true, but the time has changed and the time has evolved. And I think 70 years of war situation, and with that experience, North Korea and succeeding leaders felt they can't trust. So they need weapons to protect themselves. That's how I understand. And not less than a month ago, Kim Jong-un said, neither South Korea nor America is our enemy. We have to develop our country. So it's not necessarily that they want hang on to nuclear weapons, but they want peace and peace treaty so that they can live in peace and develop their country.
Thank you, Dr. Pak. Thank you, Mr. Zwetsloot, and also Mr. Taylor. Jacco, we hope you can rest a little bit after this. It's almost 4:15 a.m. over there.
That's right.
We can't thank you enough. Also, we will have another program next Tuesday, and then we'll have the first of the month program, and we're looking forward to seeing you on the Washington Brief also. Thank you, everyone. Do you have any final statement there, Pierre, on next week, or Larry Moffat?
Well, I'd just like to invite everyone to mark the third Tuesday of every month is the IMAP webinar. We look forward to the next one on the 16th of November.
All right, thank you.
And
Thank you.
next week we'll put together something. It'll either be IAED or IAPP. It'll either be political or business or both.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you to our panelists. Let's give them our sincere thanks. I see we have many representatives from Korea here, as well as also from around the world. And I want to thank Dr. Joseph Chung, prestigious scholar in Canada, for being with us today. Thank you so much to Robert Duffy, and also again Pierre in Canada for putting this together, and Dr. Famularo and Dr. Moon-Shik Kim from Canada. They all really playing a key role there. Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful week.
Thanks all.
Stay tuned. Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Thank you.
Everybody,
Thank you. Good night.
stay tuned to NK News too. It's one of the best. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone.